The series I've been going through in the book of Mark. And I told you the reason for that was I'm moving my Looking Intently ministry from the website to YouTube, and that took a lot of time and effort, a lot of things I had to learn, and so I was glad for the break for that. But there was another reason that I took that break from Mark. That was I was sort of hoping Jesus would come back before I got to this passage today. I don't know of any preacher who likes to preach on the subject of divorce. And the reason is for the same one it came up. The reason it was brought up by the Pharisees. Because they knew that people had widely differing opinions, and whatever Jesus said, someone was going to be mad at him. And that's pretty much the same thing today. Whatever I say, there are going to be people who think I'm too liberal and too loose in what I say, and then there'll be people who think I'm too legalistic, too strict in what I say, and often on that side of things it includes, well, you just don't understand. And in one sense, I don't understand it firsthand. I've not been divorced, but I will tell you this to help give some background in how I approach this, is my parents have been divorced. They've since remarried. My wife has been divorced. And she will tell you, she brings it up because she will be quick to say it was her responsibility, she shouldn't have done it. She also wishes people, especially Christians, had given her more input and pushed her toward reconciling. And because of that, she is more than happy anytime to help any way she can. We counsel people, and we've been able to help some couples. And so I have that connection to it. I will say this, though, and the reason that it can be viewed so many different ways, I truly believe the subject falls under what the Bible calls a disputable matter. It talks about that in the Bible. There are some. The problem is we never seem to think something we have an opinion about is disputable. If I think I know the answer, it must not be disputable. And as a matter of fact, I think the list is so small, most people would seem to think it's only like the end times. And I know some people with end times views who don't think those are disputable. Well, I think this falls under disputable. I think we even see it in the text here. And so I'm going to do my best to tell you what I believe the Bible says about this. And because of that, or in terms of how to do that, I'm going to bring in some other passages. We don't usually do that going through Mark because I want it to be, here's what the book of Mark says. There's a reason he said things and left out other things. But today, this is more of a topical sermon. We're going through Mark, and it comes up here in chapter 10. But I want to cover this subject, so we're going to look at also what it says in, especially in Matthew, that parallel passage. And as we do, the outline, so to speak, is basically we're going to see what the Bible says about divorce, and then the related subject of remarriage. And then also I want to say this, that the guiding principle for this and really any sermon, any time we approach the Bible and try to understand it, is we need to interpret less clear passages in light of clear passages. And so I'm going to try to do that today as we look at this. So with that said, I don't hear a trumpet, so I guess I got to do this. Mark chapter 10, verse 1. And he left there and went to the region of Judea and beyond the Jordan, and crowds gathered to him again. And again, as was his custom, he taught them. Now, to give this setting, he left there, that's Galilee. Jesus is leaving the northern part, the more rural part, the part where his enemies, the Pharisees, weren't as strong. They were centered in Jerusalem. He's headed down toward Jerusalem, and this will be the last time. He's approaching the end of his life here on earth, the final phase of his ministry. Another thing that's significant is it talks about beyond the Jordan, so he's on the east side, out of the territory specifically of Israel, but the thing that's important about that, it was a territory ruled by Herod Antipas, and that comes into play a little bit in the next verse. As the Pharisees came up to him in order to test him, they asked, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?" Now it says right there, they wanted to test him. They didn't really care what he said. They weren't looking for his wisdom. They wanted to put him on the spot, and they knew that there was a controversy. And they hoped that Jesus would get caught up in that some people would turn against him because of what he said, some of this crowd that was following him. And maybe they even hoped it would go a step further, because if you remember, Herod Antipas is the one, he divorced his wife, and Herodias divorced her husband. They married each other. John the Baptist, said that shouldn't have happened, that was wrong. And you remember Herod's wife especially got angry at that. Herod had him arrested and eventually he was put to death. And so you have to think the Jewish leaders were hoping, well, maybe Jesus will get in trouble. We get him to say something. So that was all what was behind what they were saying. But nonetheless, Jesus tells us things we need to know about the subject. Verse 3, he answered them, "What did Moses command you?" Now you look at a question like that. Obviously, one, Jesus knew what Moses commanded. It wasn't like, I can't remember. And two, Jesus knew there was a controversy on this subject. And so that right there, that's not why he's saying it. What he's saying, and the reason he's saying it, is to just confirm the authority of Moses. The main verse that came into play in Jesus' day, and we're going to look at, was clearly written by Moses. But the point is, there's going to be some other verses on the subject that were also written by Moses, that also fall under what did Moses say, that often got left out in their thinking. Verse 4, they said, Moses allowed a man to write a certificate of divorce and to send her away. Well, what they're talking about, the main passage that was in focus in Jesus' day was Deuteronomy 24, verse 1. It's on your outline there. It says, when a man takes a wife and marries her, if then she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, and she departs out of his house. Now you can tell it continues. This was not the main focus of that passage, but the setup to it is what was the main focus of the controversy at Jesus' time. And the real issue was on that phrase, if he found some indecency in her. All right, what's that mean? And there were a variety of opinions, two extremes really. Matthew 19:3, the parallel passage, gives some indication of that. It says, and the Pharisees came up to him and tested him by asking, is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? So you had this phrase from Moses, from Deuteronomy, that said, found any indecency in her. What's that mean? Well, there were two schools of thought. There was the conservative school following a rabbi named Shammai who said that only means adultery. If she has committed adultery, then the husband can divorce her. But you had a liberal school of Hillel who said it can be literally anything. If your wife burns the toast, that's indecency, you can divorce her for that. And had a list of things just as small and minute as that. And those were the two opinions. And as a matter of fact, the majority opinion was the anything goes opinion. Whatever it is that you don't like, you can divorce your wife. Well, Jesus answers that in Matthew 19 as well. He says, I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. So he lets us know which side he falls on in that. Well, you look at verse 4 again, there's another lesson, and I'm going to try to make sure I cover all the things that might come up in this, any questions that you might have. Verse 4, they said, Moses allowed a man to write a certificate of divorce and send her away. In the Matthew account, when they confront him there, it's worded a little differently. They said to him, why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and send her away? Jesus said to them, because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And so there's a point to be made there. It is never a requirement to divorce someone. Even if your spouse commits adultery, you're not required to divorce them. And that's the point Jesus is making. They said Moses commanded, like Jesus said, no, Moses allowed it. If you're going to do it, he's commanded how to do it, but he didn't command anyone to ever get divorced, and there is no command like that. And maybe you know some people, I know some couples who there has been adultery in the relationship. They chose to work it out, and they have worked it out, and now have a great marriage. So you never have to. We're going to see this is one of the biblical exceptions, adultery, but you never have to. Verse 5, Jesus said to them, because of your hardness of heart, he wrote you this commandment. And so that's really the key here. This verse that they were talking about, the Deuteronomy 24:1, they were just sort of thinking, all right, Moses said to do this, and now it's just a matter of what's justifiable cause. And Jesus is going to point out, well, one, it's not that extreme of burnt the toes, but also you need to understand the only reason he even said it was because of the hardness of your heart. He wrote this commandment, and realize, of course, Moses wrote it, but it came from God. And so what I want to what that we need to look at in light of that is God's two goals regarding divorce. When we look at what the Scripture says, God's two goals regarding divorce. The first one is that it wouldn't happen. That's what God's ultimate goal regarding divorce is, that it wouldn't happen. The Bible says God hates divorce because He knows what it does. He doesn't want it to come about. And so regarding Deuteronomy 24, again, Jesus said it's because of the hardness of your heart. And we've seen that phrase in Matthew as well, but we've seen it in Mark as we've been going through. And it's the idea, the hardness of heart means that the evidence comes into my mind. The way that human action works is my mind, my heart, my will. I understand, I believe something in my mind, I commit to it with my heart, and then I act on it with my will, and generally consistently with my heart, but not always. But at least I have that direction. My heart makes that commitment. Well, the hardness of heart means that the evidence is there, but my heart says, I don't want to believe it, to follow it. I don't want to commit to that. I want to do something else. And that's what Jesus is talking about. You had the evidence, you had the reason, you had what you should do, but because of the hardness of your heart, you're refusing to follow that. Well, what was their heart hard about? What was the evidence they had? Well, that's what Jesus goes on to say, and that's why he brought up, what did Moses say? Because what he's quoting here in verses 6 through 8, well, they're verses that occur earlier, but in the writings of Moses. Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. The Jews knew them as the books of Moses. So they always brought up, what did Moses say in Deuteronomy 24? Well, Jesus is making the point, yeah, he said that. That's because you wouldn't listen to what he said in these verses that he quotes here. Verse 6 says, from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh, so they are no longer two, but one flesh. Jesus says, Moses, he wasn't saying, hey, here's a good thing to do, divorce your wife. He's saying, I know what's going to happen as time goes on. Here's how to do it. But it's because you won't listen to what God said before that when you're married, you're not to get unmarried. You're not to get divorced because you become one flesh. One commentator said about this, being one flesh was the language of family. And you see this in Genesis 29 in terms of when Jacob goes to see his uncle Laban. He says, you are my flesh. And he realized there's an obligation I have to you. Or other blood relationships that demanded loyalty, like 2 Samuel 5, where David is becoming king and the people say, you are our flesh. And they pledge loyalty. Well, he says, marriage united a couple as deeply as blood ties, forming a new family unit. It made those two people who weren't literally one flesh, it made them one flesh. So that there should be just as strong a connection as there was with your family. And he says, although modern Western readers might miss the point, breaking blood ties was normally unthinkable. Of course it did happen, perhaps even often, but except when higher loyalties prevailed, ancient writers view betrayal of family ties as wicked. So he's making the point, what you are in this culture, Jesus is saying to them, what the majority of opinion is, and even divorce in general, you're saying it's no big deal. He's saying no, it would be like betraying your own family, and in their culture that was unthinkable. But they wanted to say, well, divorce, she burnt the toast, divorce, this happened, divorce, they couldn't get along, that's no big deal. No, Jesus says it's a very big deal. It was never what God intended. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. So again, God's first goal regarding divorce was that it not happen, that you obey what God has said to do. But this passage also gives us God's second goal regarding divorce, and that was to protect women. And the reason for that is because they were more at risk for harm and hardship in light of a divorce. This certificate of divorce, again, Moses wasn't saying, here's what you have to do, divorce your wife. He was saying, if you divorce your wife, here's how you have to do it. You have to give her this official certificate of divorce. I read some things in their culture that said it even has to be on paper that is sturdy, is not going to just, wear away, with ink that's not going to fade. It has to be a certain way to do this. And the reason was so that wife would have proof, I am divorced. The husband couldn't just put her out because he was mad at her, just for a night, for a week, for a month, and she's got no way to support herself and no way then, if she wasn't divorced, to get remarried. With this paper, it's basically saying, listen, if you're going to do this, it's for real, it's permanent, it's a divorce. You're not just putting her out, leaving her on her own. You're going to give her the certificate so that she can get remarried, so that she can have a way to provide for herself. So that's what it was. It was God's way to protect women. And you even see this hinted at in one of the next verses we're going to look at, where Jesus says, if a man, or the man then, husband, commits adultery against her, not just commits adultery, against his wife. She's the one being harmed there. So God had two goals. One, don't do it, but God knew it was going to happen. So through Moses, he said, if you do it, here's how you have to do it, so that a woman has a chance of getting remarried and being cared for. Well, verse 10 then, and in the house the disciples asked him again about this matter. Well, right there, that tells you. Why would they ask him again? It still wasn't clear to them. This was a disputable matter in Jesus' day. It continues to be. He said to them, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. Now, just one idea to realize, because the question comes up, could a woman divorce her husband in these days? And when it comes to Jewish women, I read all kinds of commentaries. I read every one I had this week to see, and there were differing views. A lot of them said no. A Jewish woman at this time could not divorce her husband. One of them seemed to say, well, if she had money, she could. I don't know how that worked. Another one said a wife could not divorce her husband, but if the husband did something that was worthy of divorce, if he didn't divorce her, the elders of the town would say, you need to divorce your wife. If he was unfaithful, wouldn't do it. If he was abusing her, whatever it was, they would say, you need to divorce your wife, and it would happen. So we're not sure about Jewish women. Roman women could divorce their husbands. So, that comes up. But the big question here is how it says, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. What's that mean? Well, one view, and I'm sure you've heard it, I remember hearing it, and even throughout my later schooling, is that it's adultery when a person remarries because they're married to their original spouse in God's eyes. The idea, two people get married, it's a God-ordained marriage, and so when they get divorced, even though man has said you're divorced, God still views them as being married. So if one of those remarries, they're committing adultery against that first marriage because in God's eyes it still exists. Have you heard that? I'm guessing. Again, I remember hearing that all the time. I don't believe that's the case. It says there, Jesus said, what God has joined together, let not man separate. It doesn't say man can't separate it. It shouldn't happen, but that doesn't mean, Jesus isn't like saying it doesn't really happen. You've got your paper, it doesn't count. And one piece of evidence for this is when Jesus spoke to the woman at the well. You remember when he asked her, go bring your husband? She said, I don't have a husband. He said, that's right. You've had 5 husbands, and the man you're living with isn't your husband. Well, notice he said, you've had 5 husbands. He didn't say, you're still really married to that first guy because divorce doesn't count, so none of these other guys are your husbands. No, he said you've had 5 husbands. He recognized. You got divorced, you remarried, divorced, remarried. So I don't believe that's it. And that also means one implication that maybe, again, you've heard. There is no call then if 2 people have been divorced and then maybe 2 couples got divorced and later, 2 of those people got married to say, all right, now that you know the truth, you need to divorce your current spouse and go back to your original spouse. And, churches, leaders have said that. I don't believe that's the case because it's based on this idea that says you are still married to your original spouse. I don't believe that's the case. My view, what I think about this, is that when it says here, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery, and the same thing with the wife, I believe it's the divorce for an unbiblical reason that is adultery. I believe that phrase when he says, whoever divorces his wife and marries another, and if she divorces her husband and marries another, I think that marries another is just sort of like a part of it's like that's going to happen. If you get divorced, you're going to get remarried in that culture. We know the women needed the support. It wasn't easy to support themselves. Well, it wasn't too easy for the man to support himself as far as domestically back in that day. He wasn't going to stay single. It wasn't going to happen. It was going to happen. That was just assumed. So I think what Jesus is saying, it's the idea whoever divorces his wife, again, for an unbiblical reason, commits adultery against her. The same thing. If she divorces her husband, she commits adultery. It's the act of divorce which is unfaithfulness to the marriage. And so in that sense, adultery is figurative. It's hyperbole. But the biggest thing you have to understand, when someone uses hyperbole, when something's figurative, we will say, oh, it's not as serious because it's figurative. No, that's the very point of figurative. That's the very point of hyperbole. I say it to make sure you know how serious this is. I exaggerate so that you get the point. And Jesus does that often. You know, to understand anything, you need to look at the context. And in this case, the context is, well, does Jesus ever do that anywhere else? Yeah. Look down, or on your handout, Matthew 19:24. Jesus said, "It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven." How many of you have ever heard that, well, there was a gate in Jerusalem called the Needle Gate, and a camel would have to get down on his knees and squeeze through that little gate? It was very difficult, but it was possible. You heard that? No. That's because people we can't even begin to say that the Bible isn't totally literal. That's not how we speak. We speak figuratively like this all the time. Oh, I just said it, all the time. Do I really do it all the time? No, but I said all the time. Why? To make a point. It's what we do. It's what Jesus did. There was no gate called the Needle Gate. Why would you take your camel? There's like 12 gates into Jerusalem. Why would you go through the Needle Gate when you could go through all the gates where a camel could just walk through? Jesus was meaning to say exactly what he said. This is how hard it is. And in case we aren't sure about that, Matthew 23:24, talking to the Pharisees, "You blind guides, straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel." Okay, does camel stand for something else? They were swallowing this thing. It was called a camel in their culture. And no, he's saying you strain out the smallest little living life form and you swallow the biggest one that they were familiar with. He's making a point. When it comes to divorce even, or adultery, Matthew 5, Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Now, it adds the "in his heart" to make it even clearer there, but he's using that figuratively. You've committed adultery. You've been unfaithful to your vow to love your wife. And another thing I'd say, if we want to say, okay, adultery, the only biblical reason for divorce, and then if we take this passage literal, wives, I hate to blow your image of your husbands, and husbands, I hate to give away your secret, but I've never met a guy, since he's been married even, who hasn't had lustful thoughts. And I'm looking in the mirror when I say that. So that means every wife has a get out of marriage free card anytime she wants it. According to this verse, I can divorce for adultery. This verse says if you've lusted in your heart, you've committed adultery. Every man has lusted in his heart. You can get divorced anytime you want if that's the approach you take to that. Jesus isn't being literal there. He's saying that, but to make a point, don't think that's okay. No, that's being unfaithful to your wife too. And then you sort of combine the two together, talking about this whole marriage adultery business and being using hyperbole in general. He goes on, "If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away." Don't see any people without their right eyes. Wow, you guys aren't taking the Bible literal. "It is better to you to lose one of your members than that your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one of your members than your whole body go into hell." Jesus uses hyperbole to make a point. I think that's what he's doing here. It's not the remarriage that's adultery. It's the fact that you divorce your spouse for a reason that's unbiblical. She or he hasn't committed adultery, or we're going to look at the exception Paul gives as well. That right there is unfaithfulness to the marriage covenant that you made. So, to begin to put this together, adultery in Mark 10 is figurative, but it is serious. Again, get that out of your mind. Well, it's figurative, so Jesus didn't think it was serious. No, he thought it was very serious. That's why he used that language. Divorce, even for an unbiblical reason, is real. And I've heard, matter of fact, and it doesn't even work. I had a professor who said that was his understanding of this passage. You're married by God until there is sex outside of that marriage by one of the partners. That's adultery, and that's the only thing that breaks that union in God's eyes. Well, I realized after a while, being a preacher and people coming to me to get married, that put me in an illogical position. Say there's a couple, and we'll say the husband got divorced, and later he finds a woman he wants to marry. He does have a Christian commitment, so there was not for adultery in the marriage. It was an unbiblical divorce. He shouldn't have gotten divorced, but he did. But then he never had sex with anyone after, and they didn't have sex with each other before getting married. If they come to me to get married, and I understand that, well, you're really still married to your wife, so I can't marry you because I would be condoning and really facilitating adultery the first time you had sex with your new wife. I can't do that as a preacher. So if they tell me, he tells me, she tells me, I've not had sex, then I can't marry you. But think about it. If he tells me he has, if they tell me, oh, we have had sex here, well, then I can marry you. So if you've disobeyed God, I can marry you, but if you've obeyed God, I can't. I sort of realize that don't make sense. God didn't put things that, okay, I reward disobedience. No, they really are divorced. They really are, again, God said it, He doesn't want it to happen, but it does happen. I would also say this, remarriage is allowable, because there's some who would say that, okay, you're divorced, but you can never be married again. No, it's allowable, but the more unbiblical the reason, the more time for growth, I believe, is necessary. As a matter of fact, even if there had been adultery in the relationship, I don't believe you should go get married right away. Rebound marriages, we probably know how that works. It doesn't. So I think there needs to be time. And I would also say this, I would not marry a couple who got divorced from their spouses because they were having an affair with each other or wanted to marry each other. I wouldn't do that. But again, so that's where I start to see this. While we're on the subject, as I put on the handout there, because again, I want to cover as much of this as we can while we're here, so I don't have to do it again. The other biblical exception, 1 Corinthians 7. Paul writes, "To the rest I say, I not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. If any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever, and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. God has called you to peace." And that peace is this freedom, sort of the same word that's used when you get the certificate of divorce. You're free from that marriage. Paul is saying if two people are married and one of them becomes a Christian, this doesn't apply if you were a Christian beforehand, but if two people are married, one of them becomes a Christian, the Christian can't say, you don't share my values, I don't want to be married to you, in divorce. The Christian has to stay in that marriage. The unbeliever, though, can say, I don't want to be married to you. The believer can allow that to happen, not fight it, and then that believer is free to get remarried. You understand what it's saying there? So the one can, the believer can't. The believer is to be there and have a witness as long as they can. What this also means, and this one should make sense, but I tell you, I've seen it once in person, and I had another person ask me for a friend, and it truly was for a friend, because, I got a friend. She wasn't married. I have seen in two cases, in both cases, it was the woman who was very committed to God. I don't know exactly what the details were they married before the commitment, this or that, but the woman was clearly the believer, didn't like the fact that the husband was not near as spiritual, might come to church, but not near as spiritual, and so the one woman divorced her husband because he wasn't spiritual enough. The other woman was wanting to, and her friend was asking what I thought. So I'm going to divorce my husband. I'm going to disobey God because my husband's not spiritual enough. Yeah. No. That's not right. And being so spiritual and wanting to be so closer to God doesn't make it right. That's our society infiltrating the church. So there is that other exception. The one that comes up over and over and over and is not mentioned in the Bible is abuse. Physical abuse, emotional abuse. Here's what. It doesn't say anything in the Bible. It's not mentioned. I think one of the reasons is what I told you earlier, that I don't think a Jewish woman could divorce a man. But if the man was abusive to his wife, the elders of that town would say, divorce your wife. Give her the certificate so that she's free and can remarry. And again, in that culture, he would go with what the elders of the town said. So it seems that was understood. Jesus didn't address something that didn't need addressed. And so, and here's where it might get the most disagreement for some. If a woman is involved in an abusive relationship, she needs to leave. Every preacher agrees with that. I would say it's okay to get divorced in that situation, and a lot of reasons, just like that woman, because she needed that certificate to be able to exist. And the same thing today. You're not really going to be able to live too well with a husband, divorced, and all the things that work. You've also got the other side of it that, once you're away, if that husband, has an affair or does it with anyone else, well, then you've got the adultery clause if that falls in. But I would say even, again, if that's been tried to work out, and you just can't. There is no changing that. That's my opinion. That's a disputable matter. You may not agree with me, but that's how I see those things. I tell you, I give a lot more credit. I remember being with a woman once, and there wasn't even this abuse. Her husband was a drug user and truly had mental illness. She worked harder than any woman I've ever seen to save that marriage. She really did, over and over and over and over. I have a hard time then saying to her, no, can't divorce. You tried. He was not at all faithful to what the marriage vows were. So that's where the dispute really comes in. One other passage that I think is probably the toughest one, Matthew 5:31 and 32, says, "It was also said, whoever divorces his wife," Jesus is speaking, "let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery." Yeah, I think this is the most difficult. I also think it's the one we need to realize, and this is a little bit like read the good book like a good book. What's understood here? What isn't being said? Well, first of all, there's three people involved, right? There's the original husband, the original wife, and the new husband. It doesn't even mention the original husband's guilt. And he's the most guilty of all. He's divorcing her for reasons other than sexual immorality, right? He's the most guilty. Not saying, I've never run into a husband-wife situation where one was 100% innocent, 100% guilty. There's always some things going on. But in this case, the husband is the guilty one. He's divorcing his wife. His guilt isn't mentioned. Why? Because it's obvious. You read it, you read the good book like a good book, well, of course he's guilty. Well, then look at these others, the ones who are certainly less guilty, and they're the ones that Jesus says, hey, you're committing adultery. Like, what'd I do? Here's what I think. When it says the wife commits adultery, you'll often hear, well, it's because she's really still married to him, but she goes out and gets married to another guy to support herself, so she's committing adultery against her original husband. No. Again, I don't think that's true. The NIV, and the NIV is a less literal translation. It gives what's the thought of that. Sometimes they get it right, sometimes they don't. I think in this case they do. The NIV says makes her the victim of adultery. And I think it goes back to when that husband divorces his wife for a reason other than sexual immorality, just as Jesus says in Mark 10, that's adultery. That's unfaithfulness, figuratively, to the marriage. You made a commitment to her, and now you say, you're out of here. That's adultery. And so she becomes the victim of adultery, of what he has done, in the sense of he was unfaithful to the marriage. Plus, you have the thought that she is going to go, one, if he divorces her, and the only biblical reason is she's committed adultery, what are people going to think? She's committed adultery. And so she's a victim in that way too. And then the new husband, same thing. She marries whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. This guy didn't even know what was going on. And he commits adultery? I think the same thing. He's a victim of adultery. And one of the reasons would be if he marries the woman and the only reason her husband should have divorced her is adultery, what's your assumption about this guy? He's the one she committed adultery with. That's why he's marrying her. So I think that's what that passage is saying. I know it's a difficult passage. That's my 2 cents. Take it, but do some reading. That's what I'd say. Really do some reading, though, because again, I had always heard, well, you're still married, and so you commit one of those people divorced, they get married, it's adultery, and then I begin to think about it. No, that doesn't make sense. I'd be condoning sin. So give it some thought. Well, what is clear as we wrap this up? God created marriage to be a permanent union. Anything else short of that is missing the mark. Sin is missing the mark. Well, God's mark was, I want this husband and wife, I want this man and woman to marry and never separate. So anything short of that is missing the mark. I think we would agree. That's what God hoped for, He intended. As Christians, we committed to God's will. We signed the blank sheet that says, God, I'll do whatever you say. And so we need to realize that that's my commitment. As difficult as it is at times, and it is at times, my wife often says it's difficult to be married. Well, I'm not sure what she means by that. This also goes back to what we're seeing in this whole context of Mark on the focus on the physical versus the spiritual. If our focus is on the physical, what's best for me, what I want, well then that's where, I'm not getting along, I need a divorce comes out of. If my focus is on the spiritual, God, what do you want, even if it's difficult, that will change our approach to this. And then the other thing, and please hear this, don't tune out now, divorce is a sin, it's not the unforgivable sin. One of the articles I read told a story about a preacher who had given a sermon on Moses and how after he murdered someone, God gave him a second chance. This preacher came back to his study and he found a note by someone that said, I wish I'd murdered someone instead of gotten divorced. I could have a second chance. And sometimes we treat divorced people worse than anything else. No. Is it missing the mark? Absolutely. It's forgivable like everything else. So what will I do now? I would say two things. First of all, reconsider my perspective and attitude toward myself if I'm divorced. I've met some divorced people who, again, they're living under all these, what I consider false ideas. Reconsider my attitude toward myself. Reconsider my perspective and attitude toward others who have been divorced. This one's especially easy. If you haven't been divorced and you look at those divorced people, no. Everything in the Bible is to be seen through that lens of grace. And one thing we need to realize, grace is a two-edged sword, the good news and the bad news of grace. Grace, God loves me unconditionally. God loves me despite what? Despite my sin. That's inherent in the message of grace. If we hadn't sinned, we would not need grace if we hadn't sinned. It'd just be love. God's grace means we do deserve something else, something less, and He gives us better. That's part of the story as well. Again, I'm not saying my take on this is absolute. I would say really consider what it is. If you have questions and want to talk to me later, I'm happy to do that, whatever it is. This is one of the things God says, let's look at this through that lens of love and grace. As we get ready to close, a little different sermon than most, but there's still always this opportunity we give for anyone who needs to make a commitment. And there's always an opportunity for us. And maybe it's, as I think about this, all right, I've got a decision to make, an invitation, the way I've viewed other people, the way I've viewed myself. God doesn't want us to view ourselves with less love than we should have. And maybe it's my decision. I need to make it. I need to change that in light of this. So we're going to